Perhaps many, if not most of you, know that I spent part of my student life studying at a college in eastern North Carolina. Now, there were two basic routes that one could take to drive from my hometown of Cambridge to the college. The more scenic route was to cross the border at Buffalo and drive basically straight south through Pennsylvania into West Virginia and drive through the mountains of West Virginia and Virginia. And when you would get to North Carolina, it would bring you to a sort of central part of the state, and then you would go southeast to where the college was located. And the slightly faster and more direct route would be, of course, to cross the border at Buffalo and then go to Pennsylvania and then drive eastward in Pennsylvania and then drive southeast through Maryland and Virginia until you got to almost Washington, D.C., and then you would take a sort of ring road around the metropolitan area, and you would come to Interstate 95, which runs along the East Coast, and you would drive straight on the interstate highway, which would bring you very near, about 10 miles or so from where I was living and studying. Now, one of the times that I was driving back home in the springtime to come home for the summer, I was going the faster, more direct route. I was driving north on Interstate 95 towards Washington, D.C., and there was always a particular exit that I was looking for to catch the appropriate route around the metropolitan D.C. area, because that's a bit like driving in Toronto. It's traffic and congestion, and when you're driving through Virginia on Interstate 95, all of the exits look the same. And I got off the highway one exit too early. And I veered off to the right and then came to the road that passed over the freeway, and I turned westward, and it didn't look familiar. And very soon I came to a very fortified gate. I had come to a military installation known as the Quantico Marine Base. And when I came up to the gate, I was greeted by a military policeman who had a machine gun. And very soon I was greeted by some of his colleagues who also had machine guns. And there was a bomb-sniffing dog. And one of those mirrors on the pole that they use to look under the car. And of course, I was asked for my identification. And I handed over my passport, and after a few minutes, I was allowed to turn around and go home. I had a very good explanation and spelled it out for him in some detail about how I had just taken the wrong exit. I just want to go home. There are often times when we are asked for our identification, such as I was then, that make us uncomfortable. Perhaps in our younger days, we tried to get into an establishment where we were not quite old enough to be, and we were asked to provide some identification. Sometimes we're on the side of the road being greeted by the police officer, asking if we can show some identification. Even when we're passing through airport security, I think we're invited to show our passport or some other form of identification as well. We should be, but there is a moment of discomfort. We're being told that someone does not trust us to be who we say we are. And those moments when we're asked to show our identification are not among the most comfortable in our lives. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, even on our own, to look in the mirror and to ask ourselves who we really are. Hewitt provided a sort of retelling of the story of the baptism of Jesus for the children a few minutes ago, and then Frank read so eloquently the account of that story from the Gospel of Mark. And the story of the baptism of Jesus is a story about identities. A story that asks us to consider who others are and who we are. One of those, of course, whose identity is at play in this story is that of Jesus. We are often considering, aren't we, the identity of Jesus. The great Lutheran biblical scholar Paul L. Meyer puts it this way: who was Jesus? And who is he? Even the secular world in our day and age is interested in the question of who Jesus was and is. Just before Christmas, someone lent me an issue of National Geographic magazine, which contained a very lengthy article from a non-religious perspective considering the question, who was Jesus and who is he for people today? CNN, the cable news network, over the past few years has produced at least a couple of documentary series on Jesus, and they roll them out every Christmas and Easter. People are interested, whether they be churchgoers or not, on the question of who is Jesus. The gospel writers are, of course, centrally interested in this question. Mark, one of the New Testament gospel writers, begins his account of the life and ministry of Jesus essentially with this story of his baptism. And we're told in brief that there was a man known as John who was inviting all the people of Judea, whether they lived in the countryside or whether they came from Jerusalem, to this renewal movement for God's people, where they came out to the Jordan River in the midst of the wilderness, and they said, we're sorry for our unfaithfulness to God who has been faithful to us, and we want to turn back to God. And they were baptized in this incredible spiritual awakening. And Jesus himself was one who went to be baptized by John, and we're told quite briefly in a surveying fashion that Jesus went into the waters of the river, came back out, and when he came back out, there was a voice that spoke from heaven. As Mark narrates it, the voice said to Jesus, "You are my beloved Son." Other gospel writers put this voice from heaven in the third person. "This is my beloved Son." This difference, contrast, I think tells you something about the nature of the gospel narratives and how it is that stories get remembered and passed on. In any case, as readers and hearers of this story so many centuries later, we see clearly the point. The gospel writers are identifying Jesus as the Son of God. Well, what does that mean? It means that what's particularly important about this person Jesus and the question of identity and who he was and or is his relationship with God, maker of heaven and earth. The importance and the identity of Jesus lies in this relationship with God. And not only is this a relationship, as all relationships are of the same kind, it is a relationship of the deepest closeness and intimacy. And because of this close and intimate relationship between Jesus and God, maker of heaven and earth, we learn something of what we call the gospel, the good news. How it is that the rest of the story of Jesus' life and words and actions and death and resurrection are good news for us. In saying that Jesus is the Son of God, the gospel writers are pointing out the kind of knowledge of God to which God calls and invites us. So often we as people of faith, and I am included very much in this categorization, think of God in intellectual terms. We want to know what is the right and the truthful thing to think about God. And while indeed God has given us the ability to reflect intellectually on what we might think and believe in God, we discover as we read through the story of the Bible, whether it be the New Testament Gospels or any other text, we are not provided so much with a set of statements to be evaluated based on their veracity, but the story which tells of an invitation to relationship. And it is this kind of relational knowledge which God calls to the forefront of our minds and our hearts. The second person to whose identity this story speaks is John the Baptist. What does this account in Mark and what do the accounts in the other New Testament Gospels tell us about John? Perhaps we're drawn to the appearance of John, or the strange and unique religious lifestyle he seems to have led. Our picture of John is likely one of a wild man living in the wilderness, whose message was radical and his appearance unkempt. He ate out under the sky bugs and nutritious elements gleaned from local plant life. This is no doubt in part a picture of who John was. But the gospel narrators tell us something much more important about who John thought he was and who he said he was. He said, "There is one coming after me who is greater than I, so much greater that I am not worthy even to stoop down and untie his sandals." When I was younger, I was an avid basketball player. And I had the chance, especially as a teenager, to play on some very competitive teams. And for one season, I got to play on a basketball team with a fella whose name is Andy Kwiatkowski. He was a great basketball player. He was 6'8", very athletic, very skilled. When he went to play university basketball, he in one season was the player of the year in Canada. He played for a little while on the Canadian national team. He was on the team that helped qualify for the Sydney Olympics in 2000. He even had a tryout with the Toronto Raptors. Now, I was a good player as a teenager, but not a great player. And truth be told, I was not worthy to bend down on the floor and untie Andy's sneakers. Now imagine for a moment if I lived under the illusion that I was the kind of athlete or player that he was. And if I was living under that kind of illusion, I would have missed the uniqueness and the wonder of that experience. I would not have appreciated it for what it was. In the midst of such self-delusion, I would have missed it altogether. But because I had at least a somewhat realistic assessment of my own capabilities, I was able to enjoy that, and still to this day, I'm able to look back and say, wow, what a treat. Because John knew who he was in relation to Jesus, he was unable to understand and appreciate the grace and the love and the mercy and the power of God as expressed in that person, Jesus. If we think we deserve everything we get, then we can never appreciate grace. But because John knew exactly who Jesus was, and therefore who he really was, John knew that grace and love of God perhaps as no one ever has. This story invites us finally to consider our identities, to ask ourselves who we really are. I've heard many sermons preached on this particular story, and almost every time that I can remember, I have been told, along with all of my fellow listeners, that these words spoken from heaven were not necessarily addressed to Jesus, but addressed to me and to us. This does a disservice to the text, and it does a disservice to ourselves if we think that we can take a shortcut in our relationship with God. What I think this story wants us to consider is both that we are unworthy to bend down and untie the strap of Jesus' sandal, and that we are beloved children of God. And we can be both, because who we really are and who we can be depends not on ourselves, but but on Jesus and who he is and who he declares us to be. For he is the Son of God with the closest and most intimate relationship to the Creator, which is beyond imaginable. And yet he calls us his brothers and sisters. I am not a hoarder, but I am a keeper of souvenirs. And I have on a shelf at home all of my old passports, canceled and with holes punched or corners cut. I just so happen to have the passport which I handed to that military police officer, so frightening, many years ago. Have you ever looked at the inside of your passport if you're a Canadian citizen? It says, "The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada requests in the name of Her Majesty the Queen all those whom it may concern to allow the bearer to pass freely without let or hindrance, and to afford the bearer such assistance and protection as may be necessary." You know, when we travel with this document, we are being vouched for by the Queen through her representatives. Those whom we encounter are being asked to give us such passage or protection as she herself might receive, within reason, of course. And just as much as we Canadians may have the blessing of traveling around the world in the name of the Queen, we as Christians have the privilege and blessing of traveling through life in the name of Jesus. For it is because of what he did and what he said, and even more so, who he was, we bear his name and his imprint. Beloved children of God, to whom be all praise and glory. Amen.